The wind off the Missouri had a smell to it that year, half frost, half smoke. It came sweeping down from the Milk River country and curled through the log stockades of Fort Union like a restless spirit, stirring the canvas roofs and the smell of hides. Inside the palisade, the autumn trade was at its height. Carts creaked under the weight of beaver pelts, mules brayed, and the mixed tongue of the frontier, French, English, Crow, Mandan, and a dozen half-learned dialects rose and fell like surf on a stony beach. Elias Carter stood at the long counter of the bourgeois store, running his hands over the thick bundles of furs newly brought in by a Taos outfit. He was 40, maybe a touch older, though the mountains made age a poor measure of years. His beard had gone to iron gray, his eyes pale as melted snow, the color of a sky before a storm. For 15 seasons he had traded up and down the upper Missouri, first for the American Fur Company, later on his own account, scraping profit from hides, tallow, and whatever a man could haul in and out of Indian country. The Taos trappers who had brought the bales were a lean, dark-skinned crew, New Mexicans mostly, with one or two half-breeds who spoke a rough mountain French. They had come up the Santa Fe Trail, crossed the Arkansas, and followed the old Spanish path north along the Platte. Their packs were heavy with winter-caught beaver, good deep pelts, and a few rolls of deerskin stitched with bright thread in the Mexican way. When Carter slit one bale open to judge the quality, something thin and stiff slid out between the hides, a parchment scrap, darkened with grease and smoke, its edges cracked like old bark. The trader turned it over in his hands, at first thinking it no more than a wrapper for tobacco or a stray bit of ledger paper. But there were markings on it, lines, symbols, and a crude compass rose inked in red. The leader of the Taos men, a short fellow with a scar down his cheek, shrugged when Carter asked. "Es viejo," he said, old. "We find in chest many years before, from Padres maybe." The parchment smelled of musk and dust. Across its lower edge, written in a wavering Spanish hand, was a single phrase, Camino de las Minas Perdidas, the road of the lost mines. That night, after the fort's gates were barred and the whiskey barrels drawn in, Carter spread the parchment across a table in his quarters. The firelight picked out the red ink, the faint traces of mountains and rivers. He had seen many maps in his time sketches made by traders, by trappers, by men like Jedediah Smith who had charted the far reaches of the Rockies before falling to an arrow. But this was different. The mountains were drawn not as single lines but as ranges, folded like waves. A cross marked a place in the southern country beyond the headwaters of the Rio Grande. Charles Larpenteur, the fort's clerk, happened to pass by and peered over Carter's shoulder. Another of them. "Spanish fairy tales," he said with a dry laugh. "Every season some fool comes up from Taos with a paper full of red ink and promises of gold. They say Coronado himself left half a dozen such maps behind when he lost his way." Carter said nothing. He traced the faint curve of a river line with one calloused finger. "Maybe," he murmured. "But somebody took the trouble to draw this with care. Look, these marks follow real country. The San Juan, perhaps, maybe even the Rio Chama." Larpenteur shrugged and went back to his ledgers. "Men have died for less sense," he said. Fort Union that winter was a world unto itself, a patch of civilization crouched in a sea of wilderness. Within its high log walls stood the bourgeois house, the blacksmith shop, the Indian trade room, and the warehouse stacked with bales marked A.F.C., American Fur Company. Outside lay the camp of Assiniboine lodges, their fires glowing red under hides stiff with frost. Traders, interpreters, boatmen, and voyageurs came and went daily. A man could hear a dozen languages before breakfast and see as many nations before dusk. It was a place of rumors as much as trade. Around the night fires men spoke of lost valleys, hidden mines, cities of gold buried under the mountains. Some swore there were still Spanish caches west of the Rockies, sealed since the time of the friars. Others laughed, saying the only metal worth a man's trouble in the wilderness was the iron in his traps. Elias Carter listened, but kept his thoughts close. He had been long enough in the trade to know that every myth carried a kernel of truth. The old Spaniards had indeed come north in search of precious ore, their worn trails still cut through the Sangre de Cristo mountains. The padres at Taos had kept records, journals, sketches, lists of failed expeditions. If one such map had survived the centuries and found its way into a pelt bundle, who was to say what it might lead to? He began copying the fore, parchment by candlelight, using ink ground from soot and bear grease. Each night he compared the faint lines to the maps he had seen of the western rivers. Something in the pattern drew him the way the trail wound south, crossed 2 mountain chains, and ended in a circle marked by a sunburst cross. By mid-December, the first hard freeze had locked the river. Flatboats lay moored under a crust of ice, and the air rang with the sound of axes splitting firewood. Inside the fort, men spoke of the coming rendezvous in the Green River country where the trappers would gather come summer to trade their pelts. One evening, as the aurora shimmered over the plains, Carter sat alone in the trade room, the map spread before him. He heard the door creak and looked up to see a tall, raw-boned man in a buffalo coat, Joseph McKinnon, a mixed-blood interpreter who had ridden in with a band of Crow that afternoon. McKinnon glanced at the parchment and smiled faintly. "That looks like trouble," he said. "You can read it?" "Some of it. My grandfather told of such drawings, marks left by Spaniards who came north with mules and chains. They said the earth swallowed their minds when the mountains took fire. He claimed to have seen a place where iron still lay rusting in the stone." Carter leaned forward. "Where?" "In the high country of the San Juan," McKinnon replied. "But you'll not find it by following ink. The old trails twist like snakes. Better to ask the wind." Carter folded the map carefully and slipped it into his coat. "Then I'll ask both," he said. Outside, the moon hung over the plains like a hammered coin. Beyond the fort's walls stretched 1,000 miles of unknown country rivers, uncharted, passes unnamed. Men had died trying to measure it, and yet it called to him as nothing else could. The map in his pocket was only parchment and ink, but to Elias Carter it carried the weight of a promise. That somewhere beyond those frozen horizons lay the proof that myth and record were one and the same. In the weeks to come, he would trade his winter stock, gather a small outfit, and ride south toward the country of the lost mines. But that night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the wolves howled across the prairie, he sat by the dying fire, tracing the red lines once more, and whispered to himself the words written at the map's edge, "Las Minas Perdidas," the lost mines. When the river ice broke, it went all at once like thunder rolling underfoot. The Missouri swelled with meltwater, carrying branches, carcasses, and pieces of winter itself downstream. Fort Union came alive with the noise of the new season, steamboats coughing smoke, mules braying in harness, voyageurs shouting over the creak of wagons. In that season of breaking and renewal, Elias Carter began to ready himself for the trail. He sold off his winter stock of pelts and took payment in goods that might outlast hardship powder, lead, salt, dried beans, a coil of brass wire, a dozen traps, and a small sextant he had traded from a surveyor the year before. Most men leaving Fort Union talked of easy trade or good trapping grounds. Carter spoke of none of that. When asked his business, he only said he was going south to look at country. Joseph McKinnon agreed to ride with him, a favor, he claimed, to his grandfather's memory. The interpreter was a man of 30, quiet and self-contained, his hair bound with a strip of red cloth, his speech an easy mix of English and Crow. He carried a long rifle, a knife with a carved antler hilt, and the kind of patience born of men who've traveled alone. They left the fort under a gray sky, following the old buffalo traces that crossed the breaks and rolled down toward the Yellowstone. The prairie grass was still winter dead, but geese had begun their northward cry. For the first week the two men rode in silence, their breath frosting the air, the horses' hooves sinking in, thawing mud. Each night by the fire, Carter brought out the parchment, now sealed in an oiled case. He had traced it onto new paper, sketching the lines again and again until he could see them behind his eyelids. The trail it showed began near the Upper Platte, curved south by the Wind River Range, then turned toward the high country of the San Juan. "See here," he said one evening. The map spread across his knee. "This bend, it matches the Sweetwater Valley. And here, beyond it, must be the Green River Basin." McKinnon watched the firelight crawl across the ink. "Many have crossed those same valleys," he said. Few came back with what they sought. "You believe the mines existed?" Carter asked. "I believe the Spaniards looked," McKinnon replied. "They brought slaves from the pueblos to dig. Some never went home. My grandfather said they left ghosts behind." Carter gave a short nod. "Then maybe we'll find where those ghosts still walk." By the time they reached the Wind River, spring had come in full. The mountains to the west gleamed white against a sky as blue as fired glass. Herds of elk grazed along the foothills, and the rivers ran clear with meltwater. They traveled by day and camped near timber, building fires of cottonwood and juniper. At one camp they met a party of free trappers heading north, ragged men in buckskins, faces wind-burned, their packs heavy with beaver. Around the evening fire, talk turned to the coming rendezvous at Horse Creek, to rumors of new forts along the Green, and to the old tales that never died. "You're headed south, eh?" one trapper asked Carter. "Better take a shovel if you mean to chase them Spanish mines. I've heard tell of 100 such fools, and not one come back with more than frostbite." Another laughed and spat into the coals. "Hell, the only gold in these parts is the sun on your rifle barrel." Carter only smiled. "Maybe so," he said, "but sometimes a map shows more than gold." When the men had gone to their blankets, McKinnon looked across the dying fire. "They think you mad," he said. "I'd rather be mad and moving," Carter answered, "than sane and standing still." Crossing the Continental Divide, they entered the high country where wind never stopped. Here the trail grew faint and the distances deceptive. A ridge that seemed a mile away might take a day to reach. They followed game tracks through spruce forests and narrow passes, the air thin and sharp in their lungs. One morning they came upon a cairn of stones stacked neatly at the edge of a ravine. On its top lay a fragment of rusted iron, part of a chain link, hand-forged. Carter lifted it and rubbed the rust away. "Spanish work," McKinnon said softly. Carter's pulse quickened. "So they came this far." McKinnon nodded, and perhaps no farther. They buried the chain again beneath the stones, as if to keep the mountains secret. As April waned, the weather turned mean. Snow squalls came without warning, followed by days of thaw that left the ground a sea of mud. Their horses grew lean, their powder grew damp. Yet each hardship seemed to sharpen Carter's resolve. One evening, while the wind moaned through the pines, he sat writing by the fire notes on bearings, distances, and landmarks. His handwriting was rough but steady. Range west of Wind River limestone ridges, signs of old workings, cross marks on stone, perhaps made by early prospectors. He closed the book and stared into the flames. "If this leads nowhere," he said, "at least we'll leave a better record than the last men." McKinnon stirred the coals with a stick. "Records don't keep you warm," he said. "No," Carter agreed, "but they outlive the cold." The wind carried sparks upward, vanishing into the dark. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay the country of the lost mines, and beyond that, perhaps, the truth that every Andadas mountain man chased the line between what men call legend and what the land remembers. They would ride south at first light. The storm came down the mountains like a living thing, gray, howling, endless. One day the wind merely whispered among the pines, and by nightfall the whole world had turned to white. Snow swallowed the horizon, buried the riverbanks, and erased every sign of the trail they'd followed since spring. Elias Carter and Joseph McKinnon made camp beneath a cutbank where willows bent low under ice, the horses shivering and snorting steam. For 3 days they waited, feeding the fire with frozen driftwood, living on dried meat that had long since lost its flavor. The snow fell so thick it seemed the world had forgotten color. Their tent sagged under weight, and the smoke from the fire refused to rise, hanging in the air like a ghost. Carter's fingers were raw from scraping tinder. "If this keeps on," he muttered, "the mountains will take us whole." McKinnon said nothing. He was hollow-eyed, his beard rimed with frost, but his movements were careful, deliberate, the patience of a man who had seen worse and survived it. When the last of the good firewood was gone, he stepped into the blizzard and vanished. Carter thought he had gone mad. But after half an hour, McKinnon returned, his shoulders loaded with slabs of green pine. He set them in a ring and began digging into the snow with his knife, shaping a pit the size of a barrel. "We burn from inside," he said, shouting over the wind. "Hollow fire. Smoke stays under, heat stays here." Carter helped him line the hole with the wet pine and small stones from the river. McKinnon lit the core with coals from their dying fire, then covered it loosely with bark and a hide stretched tight across stakes. When the flames took, the pit began to thrum like a living heart. Warm air bled upward through the cracks, and the hide glowed faintly in the stormlight. For the first time in 92 days, the two men could cook without the wind snuffing the flame. The smoke tunneled low through the snowdrift, escaping in faint ribbons. The secret campfire trick, as Carter would later write in his journal, saved their lives that winter, a method born of Crow hunters and forgotten by most white men. They boiled their last beans, roasted strips of elk meat until it cracked in their teeth, and huddled close, the smell of pine and smoke thick in their clothes. On the 5th day, the storm broke. The morning came bright and brittle, the air so clear it rang like glass. The world had been remade white ridges, blue shadows, and a silence so deep it pressed against the ear. Their horses had survived by luck and instinct, scraping lichens from the rocks. The men packed what little they had left and started south again, following the course of a frozen creek that twisted toward the mountains. Carter wrote later that the cold seemed to come from the bones of the earth. His hands bled whenever he touched metal, yet even in that desolation he kept the parchment map close, sealed in oiled cloth against his chest. McKinnon led the way, reading the land as if it were a language. He pointed out wind-scoured boulders that marked ancient trails, places where the Crow once crossed with their lodges. At night, when the stars were sharp as flint chips, he spoke of his grandfather's tale, a party of Spaniards with mules and chains, vanishing into the mountains and never returning. "They dug where the sun hides in winter," he said. "The earth closed around them. Some say their fires still burn under the snow." Carter smiled faintly. "If that's true, we're heading in the right direction." A week later, they found the remains of a campsite at the mouth of a canyon, a ring of stones, blackened with ancient soot, half buried in snow. Near it lay a length of wood, squared by hand, harder than any pine. Carter split it open with his hatchet and found the grain darkened with pitch. "Timber from below the ground," he said softly. "They shored their tunnels with this." McKinnon ran his fingers along the cut marks. "Long ago," he murmured. "Before my grandfather's time, maybe before his father's. They built their fire on that same ring of stones, using the hollow core trick again. Above them, the canyon walls glowed rose in the sunset, and ravens wheeled against the wind. For the first time in months, Carter felt something like belief take root, a sense that the myth he'd chased was shifting into the realm of fact. He opened his journal and wrote by the flicker of the fire, "Evidences of Spanish work. Old camp. River runs south by west. Snow deep, but less each day. Faith and frost both bite hard. When the thaw came, it came cruelly. The snow turned to slush, the rivers swelled, and the ground swallowed the hooves of their horses. They lost a mule crossing a flooded stream and nearly lost themselves in a landslide of melting snow. One night, drenched and cold, Carter sat staring at the parchment map by the firelight. The inked lines seemed to twist and blur as if the map itself were breathing. He thought of Larpenteur's laughter at Fort Union, of men who said such maps were made only to fool dreamers. Yet here he was, alive by a miracle of fire and ingenuity, standing on the same ground those forgotten Spaniards had once cursed. He looked at McKinnon. "We're close," he said. "I can feel it." The interpreter gazed toward the dark mountains. "Maybe, but the closer a man gets to his dream, the more it looks like snow." Carter smiled wearily. "Then I'll keep digging." The wind sighed through the canyon, carrying with it the smell of thawing earth and pine. The storm had not broken them, it had refined them, burned away doubt, left only the iron core of purpose. They packed their gear at dawn, stamped out the embers of their secret fire, and rode toward the black peaks on the horizon. Somewhere beyond them, if the map spoke true, the trail of the lost mines began. By the time the snow loosened its grip on the high passes, Elias Carter and Joseph McKinnon had traveled through a country few white men had ever crossed. The air thinned until every breath burned, and the mountains loomed black and cold above valleys still patched with ice. The land itself seemed older here, worn and secretive, as if holding its breath since the days of Coronado. They followed the old Spanish trail south from the Wind River Basin, guided by landmarks Carter had matched against his fading parchment, a ridge shaped like a sleeping giant, a river bending east before vanishing under cliffs, a hollow where the soil glittered faintly with metal. Each sign seemed to confirm the map's truth, yet each mile made the dream more unreal. McKinnon's Crow pony went lame crossing a shale slope, and they were forced to halt for 2 days. Carter spent the time sketching the country, marking every stream and pass, his handwriting cramped from the cold. He worked like a man possessed, convinced that if the mines were ever to be found, it would be by precision rather than luck. "You write more than you talk," McKinnon said one evening, watching him note the angle of the sun. "I've learned that the land forgets men faster than men forget maps," Carter replied. By late June they entered a canyon where the rock walls rose 1,000 feet on either side, carved smooth by centuries of water. Strange symbols appeared along the stone crosses, spirals and the faint outline of a sunburst cut into basalt. The marks were weathered but deliberate. "Spanish hands made these," Carter said, tracing a groove with his finger. "See how the chisel flares outward? Padres marked their claims like this." McKinnon frowned. "Or hunters long before the Padres. They camped beside a cold stream that night." Carter wrote in his journal, "We have come," upon evidence of early work chisels and cross marks in the canyon rock. McKinnon doubts their age, but I believe them to be of Spanish make. The trail runs due south, same as on the map. In the morning light they found a small mound of stones at the mouth of a ravine. Beneath it lay a square timber, blackened with pitch and half turned to dust. Within the same hollow they uncovered a rusted pickaxe head, its shape unmistakably European. McKinnon lifted it with both hands, the metal flaking under his grip. "So," he said quietly, "the ghosts did dig here." Carter could not speak for a moment. The map, the marks, the legends, it all converged in that single corroded piece of iron. Proof. They climbed higher into the range, through forests of spruce and aspen, where snowmelt turned the soil to mire. The peaks ahead were dark against the sky, their tops veined with silver light at dawn. To the east a vast mesa caught the sun like a mirror. It was a land that seemed at once untouched and exhausted beautiful, but burdened by the memory of men who had once come seeking its heart. On the 4th day, while crossing a narrow defile, they found a cave mouth half hidden behind a fall of rock. The air that drifted out was cold and stale, carrying a smell of earth and old smoke. Inside, the floor sloped downward, and the walls bore more of the same chiseled crosses. Carter lit a pine pitch torch and pressed forward, the light throwing long shadows across the stone. The passage opened into a chamber no larger than a cabin. There, against the far wall, stood the remains of a timbered frame, and beside it, a pile of debris that once might have been tools. Rusted bars, a fragment of chain, a wooden scoop blackened by age. "Lord above," he whispered, "they mined here." McKinnon crouched, touching the earth. "They worked it, yes, but they left in a hurry." Among the rubble they found bones small, brittle, likely animal, though one piece bore the "Animal won the W Day," unmistakable curve of a human rib. Nearby, carved into the wall, was a symbol unlike the others, a cross set within a circle, its edges darkened by soot. Carter drew it carefully in his notebook. "The Cave of the Sun Cross," he said, giving it a name that would mark his pages for decades to come. They lingered there 2 days, exploring every corner of the ravine, hoping to find veins of ore or signs of deeper tunnels. But the earth had long since collapsed inward, sealing whatever lay beyond. Carter struck the rock with his pick until sparks flew, but the stone yielded nothing but dust. When the light failed, they built a fire at the cave's mouth and sat in silence, listening to the wind rise among the pines. McKinnon spoke first. "Maybe this is all that's left of their gold bones and stories." Carter stared into the flames. "Gold or no gold, it's truth enough for me," Men came here with dreams and chains. We found where they ended." The interpreter nodded slowly. "Then what now?" Carter folded the parchment map, now worn almost to transparency. "Now we finish the line they started. South of here, the river forks twice. One branch leads toward the San Juan headwaters. That's where the circle lies on the map." McKinnon laughed softly, shaking his head. "You'd chase a shadow across the sky if a Spaniard once marked it red." "Maybe," Carter said, smiling, "but every shadow starts with light." The next morning dawned pale and thin. They packed their mules, left the cave behind, and rode south along the ridges. Behind them, the black peaks caught the sun, their faces gleaming with ice and memory. Carter looked back once, tipping his hat toward the cave mouth. "If they buried their treasure here," he said, "it's not metal, it's the proof that they lived and labored where men said they never were." McKinnon gave a low grunt of agreement. "And if the mountains keep their gold," he said, "then perhaps that's mercy." Together they rode into the wind, the map once again guiding them toward an ever-receding promise, the next range, the next valley, the next turn of the trail, where legend and record might finally meet. The valley narrowed as Elias Carter and Joseph McKinnon rode south. The mountains now rose like sentinels, black cliffs striated with pale seams of quartz and 1,000 trickles of meltwater gleaming in the light. It was country few dared to cross. Even the Ute hunters they encountered skirted the deeper ravines and warned that spirits still dig beneath the stone. By late July, the men found themselves hemmed in by rock. The map's last markings, faint and frayed, led toward a canyon that split the range like a wound. They dismounted and led their mules single file through the shadows. The air there was heavy and still, the smell of wet stone and sulfur thick enough to taste. At the far end stood what at first seemed a bluff of collapsed rock. But when the light shifted, Carter saw the outline of an archway stonework, hand-cut, half-buried by centuries of fall. His pulse quickened. They cleared debris for an hour, levering aside stones until a dark void yawned before them. "This is it," he whispered, "the last mark on the map." McKinnon peered into the darkness. Or the last mistake of the men who made it. Still, they went in. Inside, the air was cold and dry, unmoving as death. Their torches painted the walls in amber light. The passage descended steeply, and the rock showed clear signs of human labor tool marks in the stone, support beams rotted to threads, a rusted chain still bolted to the wall. Carter knelt to study the floor. Fine black dust glittered under the torchlight mica, pyrite, and traces of something heavier. "Silver," he murmured, "or lead mixed with it." McKinnon gave a low whistle. So the old ones weren't chasing shadows after all. They pressed deeper until the tunnel opened into a chamber, perhaps 20 feet across. At its center lay a pile of timbers, collapsed inward like ribs. When Carter cleared away the debris, he found a shallow shaft choked with silt. A cold draft breathed up from below, smelling of rot and minerals. He held his torch close and sawed a carved cross set into the wall, its arms flaring into a sunburst pattern filled with the same black dust. Beside it, a wooden tablet lay half-buried, the Spanish letters faint but still legible. La Cruz guarda la mina. The cross guards the mine. The air grew thinner the longer they stayed. Their torches guttered, and sweat froze to their skin. McKinnon urged retreat, but Carter's eyes had taken on a fevered gleam. He believed the shaft below led to the heart of the mine. "Help me clear it," he said. Against his better sense, McKinnon obeyed. They hauled stones aside until the hole gaped wide enough for a man to descend. Carter tied a rawhide rope around his waist and lowered himself, torch in hand. The shaft was barely 6 feet deep, the floor slanted and slick. He crouched, shining the light across the walls. Veins of metal laced through the rock, silver-gray, unmistakable. He had found it. A shout of triumph escaped his throat. But as he turned, a gust of foul air rose from the darkness below, heavy, invisible, choking. His torch sputtered once, then died. McKinnon heard the cough and the fall. He shouted, hauled on the rope, and dragged Carter upward. The trader's face was gray, his breath ragged. He coughed until blood flecked his beard. The mine's trapped gases had nearly suffocated him. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but certain. "It's there," he gasped. A vein of silver as wide as a man's arm. McKinnon looked down into the pit, then back at his companion. "And what would you do with it? Carry a mountain on your back?" Carter smiled faintly, half delirious. Maybe just a handful to prove it was real. But neither man would touch the shaft again. They filled it with stones and sealed it with a wooden cross, using the last of their pitch to blacken it. That night they built their camp outside the cave. The moonlight fell cold across the canyon, silvering the rocks. Carter lay wrapped in his blanket, too weak to eat. The fever took him before dawn, burning him with visions of Spaniards digging by torchlight, of chains clinking in the dark. He spoke in fragments, "Padres, silver, the lost light," and then fell silent. McKinnon sat watch, listening to the wind moan through the stone. He felt no triumph, only a vast stillness, as if the mountains themselves had claimed their secret back. When the morning came, he found Carter awake and calm, the fever broken. "We came for gold," Carter whispered, "but the real treasure's the truth of it." McKinnon nodded. "Truth enough to fill a grave." Carter chuckled softly, a dry sound. "Aye, but maybe it's time someone wrote it down before it's lost again." He reached for his journal and, with shaking hands, recorded their discovery in spare, precise words, found remains of Spanish mining works. Vein of ore confirmed. One man near suffocation from foul air. Site marked with sun cross. Buried again for mercy. They stayed one more day, long enough for Carter to regain his strength and for both men to carve a small sign into the canyon wall. E. C. and J. M. 1835. Then they mounted their horses and rode north, leaving the cave to its silence. The wind followed them down the valley, whispering through the pines, scattering fine silver dust across the trail. Behind them, in the heart of the mountain, the buried timbers creaked softly as if remembering men long gone. Neither would ever return. But in the years to come, traders and prospectors would hear tales of a canyon marked with a sun cross, of a lost shaft sealed by two wanderers who had touched silver and chosen instead to leave it buried. And so began the legend of the Cave of the Sun Cross, the place where myth and mercy met and where the mountains themselves decided what stories men were fit to keep. The sun hung low over the mesas, a red disk in a haze of dust. For weeks, Elias Carter and Joseph McKinnon had followed the old river south, crossing into the country of the Ute rugged plateaus, where the air shimmered and the wind smelled of sage and stone. They carried no ore, no trophies from the cave, only Carter's journal and a folded parchment, now soft as cloth from wear. Each day they rode in silence. The land itself seemed to watch them. Shadows stretched long across the basalt ridges, and the call of distant hawks echoed through the canyons like the voice of something ancient. "We ought to skirt east," McKinnon said one morning, scanning the horizon. "There's hunting parties in these parts. The Ute don't take kindly to strangers." Carter nodded, but his eyes lingered on the western horizon, where smoke curled faintly into the sky. "If they find us, we'll talk. Trade silver for peace, if need be." McKinnon smiled thinly. "You've too much faith in words, friend." "Words built every treaty in this country," Carter replied. "And broke most of them, too." They made camp that night on a high mesa overlooking a valley of red rock and piñon. Carter, still weak from his brush with death in the cave, warmed his hands over a small fire. McKinnon cooked strips of venison on a flat stone, turning them with his knife. The flames glowed low and steady, hidden from the open plain, a trick learned from the crow, fire dug deep in a pit so its light could not be seen. It was near midnight when the dogs began to bark, their sound sharp and sudden. Then came the drumming of hooves. Out of the darkness rode a band of Ute horsemen, faces painted with ochre, feathers fluttering from their hair. They circled the camp in silence, torches throwing long shadows across the rock. McKinnon rose slowly, palms open. He spoke first in Crow, then in a few halting words of Ute he had learned long ago. The leader, a tall man wrapped in a bear-hide cloak, dismounted and looked from one to the other. His eyes settled on Carter's pack. "Why come you here?" he asked in broken English. "This land not for white men." Carter stepped forward. "We follow the old Spanish trail. We mean no harm." The Ute studied him, then nodded toward the folded parchment tied to Carter's belt. "That paper, what is it?" "A map," Carter said truthfully. "From the time before, it led us to a cave where your mountains keep old things." The man's gaze hardened. "You dig?" "We filled what we found," Carter said quietly. "The earth is yours still." The leader motioned to one of his warriors, who held up the small silver cross Carter had carried since the cave, a trinket of no great worth, but gleaming in the firelight like new frost. The Ute murmured among themselves. Finally, the elder spoke again. "The cross," he said, "belongs to the mountain. It marks death. Long ago the sun hid in the ground. The Spaniards came to steal it. The mountain closed, and their fires turned to stone. You must leave it." Carter hesitated, then placed the cross in the man's open hand. "Then it returns to where it belongs," he said. They sat together around the fire after that trader, interpreter, and elder, while the younger warriors kept watch on the ridges. The elder spoke of a time when the land itself was soft and alive, when the spirits of fire and stone slept beneath the peaks. He told how the Spaniards had dug into the heart of the world, waking something that should have been left in peace. McKinnon translated softly, his voice almost reverent. "He says the mountains guard what men cannot own." Carter listened, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Then maybe that's the lesson," he said. "The map leads only to the truth. A man can't carry home." The elder nodded. "You understand." At dawn, the Ute departed, leaving behind a bundle of dried meat and a pouch of tobacco, a peace gift. Carter and McKinnon watched them fade into the rising sun, the sound of their ponies echoing through the canyon. That day they climbed higher onto the mesa to see the country one last time. The land unfolded in every direction, ridges, canyons, and rivers braided like veins of copper. Below them, the fire pit still smoldered, a curl of smoke rising into the calm air. Carter opened his journal and wrote with slow care, "Met with Ute band, peace given. The mountains hold their own counsel. The cross returned. Let it stay so." He paused, then added, "What we call discovery may only be remembering what the earth already knew." McKinnon sat beside him, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. "So this is how it ends? No gold, no glory, just smoke and words?" Carter smiled faintly. "Smoke and words are what history's made of." McKinnon chuckled. "Then you'll have enough to fill a book." "Maybe just a few pages," Carter said, closing the journal. "But enough to mark the way." As evening fell, a storm gathered over the distant peaks. Lightning flickered like veins of light beneath the clouds, striking the ridges where the cave lay hidden. Carter and McKinnon stood watching in silence. The air smelled of rain and ash. McKinnon spoke softly. "If the mountains remember us, I hope it's kindly." Carter nodded. "The mountains remember everything. That's their curse and their grace." When the first drops fell, they stamped out their fire and saddled their horses. The rain hissed on the coals, sending up a brief, bright glow, one last flare on the mesa before darkness swallowed it whole. And as they rode north through the downpour, leaving behind the land of the Sun Cross, it seemed to Carter that the storm itself was a benediction, a reminder that some fires, once given back to the earth, burn longer than men can see. By the time Elias Carter and Joseph McKinnon reached the Arkansas, the aspens had gone to gold. The wind that came off the plains was no longer warm. It carried the smell of winter and smoke, and the promise of snow somewhere far behind them in the mountains. The two men rode thin horses and wore coats patched with sinew and rawhide. Their packs held no ore, no trophies, only notebooks, pelts, and the map that had led them to the edge of death and back. Fort Bent stood on the southern bank like a lone ship in a sea of grass-thick adobe walls, a bastion at each corner, and a flag that snapped in the high wind. Wagon ruts and moccasin prints marked the clay road to its gate. Traders, Mexicans, Cheyenne, and half-breeds crowded the courtyard, shouting over one another in a dozen tongues. Smoke curled from the forge, and the scent of buffalo fat and horse sweat hung in the air. As they rode through the gate, Carter felt the peculiar quiet that comes when a long silence ends. For months, the only voices he had heard were wind and McKinnon's low muttering. Now the noise of commerce rang around him like music. A clerk in a blue vest came forward. quill in hand. "You from the Green River outfit?" he asked. Carter shook his head. "From nowhere particular. Just wintering in." The man squinted. "You look like you've come through hell to get here." Carter smiled. "Hell's on the map, friend. I've walked it." They stabled their animals, paid in pelts, and took quarters in a low room off the main hall. The next day, Carter found himself sitting at a table with William Bent, himself broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, his manner a mixture of frontier ease and merchant discipline. "You're Carter," Bent said. "I've seen your name in Larpenteur's ledgers up north. Traded out of Fort Union, didn't you?" "Aye," Carter replied. "And further west since then." Bent poured 2 cups of coffee thick as syrup. "Word says you were chasing a Spanish ghost down in the San Juans." Carter looked up slowly. "Word travels faster than I ride." Bent chuckled. "Out here, stories are a form of trade." Carter reached into his coat and drew out the folded parchment, laying it on the table. Its edges were worn translucent, its ink faint but legible. "Here's the ghost," he said. "It led to ruins, not riches, a mind sealed by time and mercy." Bent studied it in silence. "If this is what I think it is," he murmured, "you've found what every fool prospector from Taos to Street Lewis has been chasing 100 years. "Found it and left it," Carter said. Bent raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Carter's answer came without hesitation. "Because the mountains wanted it that way, and because some treasures are better written down than dug up." That winter, while snow gathered against the fort walls, Carter set to work transcribing his notes. Page after page, he mapped the routes they had taken, the shape of rivers, the position of passes, the marks of trails known only to Indian hunters. His sketches were rough but steady, his descriptions spare. High country beyond Wind River, timber thinned, traces of ore, Spanish remains. McKinnon teased him for it. "You're turning myth into bookkeeping," he said one night over a mug of whiskey. Carter smiled. "Better that than let the myth turn me into another ghost." He sent copies of his journal east with the spring caravans to Street, Louis, to a surveyor named Nicolet, and to a fur trader in Independence who dealt with army cartographers. He wrote letters to Larpenteur, to whomever might still care about the land's unrecorded corners. "The map you once called folly," he wrote to Larpenteur, "has proved itself not in silver, but in knowledge. The Spaniards' trail was real, their ruin complete. The earth they scarred has healed, but their markings will serve future men who read the land with less greed and more awe. When the snows melted, the plains turned green again, and the river broke its ice with a crack like musket fire." Carter often walked the ramparts at dusk, looking west where the mountains lay in blue shadow. Sometimes McKinnon joined him, pipe in hand, watching the cranes rise from the marsh. "So what now?" the interpreter asked one evening. "Back to trading?" "Perhaps," Carter said, "but I think I've traded enough years for pelts. I'd rather give something back to the land than take from it." McKinnon grinned. "That sounds like talk fit for a preacher, not a mountain man." Carter laughed softly. "Maybe the mountains did the preaching. I just listened." By late spring, word began to spread along the frontier routes of a trader named Carter, who had found proof of lost Spanish workings, and who, instead of staking claim, had mapped the valleys with uncanny precision. Army officers requested copies. Fur company scouts traced his routes. Some said his notes guided later expeditions into the San Juan country, where Fremont and Carson would one day pass. Carter never claimed credit. When asked, he said only, "The map did the finding. I just followed it long enough to learn what it really meant." The last entry in his surviving journal, dated June 12, 1836, reads, "The treasure was not metal nor stone, but direction. The land is its own archive, waiting for men to learn its script. The Spaniards dug into its flesh for gold and found death. I traced their scars and found life. Perhaps that is the truest wealth a man can earn." Years later, long after Elias Carter's name faded from the ledgers, explorers still carried copies of his map. It guided none to silver, yet led many safely through the high country he charted. The cave he sealed was never rediscovered, though some claim to have seen the mark of a blackened cross on a canyon wall where no sunlight reached. But those who had known him at Fort Bent remembered a man with frost still in his beard and a strange gentleness in his eyes. A man who spoke of mountains as if they were old friends, not obstacles. And when travelers asked him what he'd found out there in the wild, he would smile and answer, "Only proof that a myth, once followed far enough, becomes a map of the soul." The wind across the prairie carried his words long after he was gone, an echo in the vast country he had walked, where ink and earth had met and made something that would outlast both. A record of wonder written in the language of the mountains.